Welcome, everyone, to the final session of the Poverty Narrative Series, dedicated to a deeper understanding of poverty in the U.S. and especially the Midwest. I'm Kristen Seefelt, and I'm the Associate Director of Educational Programs at Poverty Solutions, and I'm also a faculty member at the University of Michigan. I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. Over the course of the series, we've explored topics such as inequality in the time of COVID, how to use data in storytelling, and rethinking the poverty narrative, all in the hopes of promoting in-depth and impactful solutions to issues related to poverty. If you missed any of our previous live sessions, they're all available at the Poverty Solutions website at poverty.umich.edu. Please feel free to check them out. This series is supported by the Midwest Mobility from Poverty Network with generous support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'm really excited about today's session, using personal stories for systemic change. I myself am someone who uses a lot of storytelling in her own research, so I really appreciate the power that a personal narrative can have. But before we dig into this conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions in the comment box on YouTube to the right, or you can submit a question on Twitter using the hashtag Poverty Narrative. We look forward to having a meaningful conversation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue, but we do want to let folks know that we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. So sharing personal stories of people directly affected by issues of poverty can be a powerful way to raise awareness of an issue and also to spur action. And I'm thrilled to be joined by two panelists today who will share strategies for identifying people whose personal experiences illustrate broader issues and how sharing those stories can contribute to systemic change. First, we have Marisol Bello, who is the Director of Communications for Community Change and the Center for Community Change Actions. Before that, she was a journalist for more than 20 years in newsrooms ranging from Philadelphia to Detroit to DC. She was most recently a national reporter and editor for USA Today, where she spent 8 years covering high-profile events such as the recession of the late 2000s and its impact on American families, the death of Nelson Mandela and the future of South Africa without him, and the deadly earthquake that devastated Haiti, which was already a nation that was facing a lot of challenges. Our second panelist is Marissa Kwiatkowski, who is an investigative reporter. You may also, if you watched the recent Netflix documentary Athlete A, recognize her from there as well. She handles investigative reporting related to social services, welfare, and issues including child abuse and neglect, poverty, elder abuse, human trafficking, domestic violence, all at USA Today. So thank you both so much for being here today. As I noted earlier, my own research involves interviewing people to hear about their stories. So we're going to start off with Marisol, and you have a video to sort of lead us off in our discussion.
Yes. First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me, Kristen. And it's so good to meet you also and see you, Marissa, fellow USACP folks. And so thank you so much. I'm excited today, and I'm happy to talk a lot about the role and the need for elevating diverse voices. And so we thought that I thought that the best way, or a really good way, to kind of kick off the work that I'm doing now is through this video that we'll show you. In owning our narrative, there's a power.
The people who are closest to the injustice need to have the loudest voices.
How does that make you feel when that happens? When you looked at it and you know big chunks of the person's or the community stories have been left out?
The Communications Fellows program is really about working with members of our communities to say your experience matters, your story matters, how you view the world, your truth matters, and the best person to tell that story, the best person to tell that truth is you. All right. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about this topic. It's one of my favorite things to talk about and a deep passion of mine. As Kristen mentioned, I was a journalist for pretty much all of my career, and a lot of the stories that I wrote were related to poverty and families in crisis. And as someone who grew up in the Bronx, first generation child of immigrant family, I didn't always feel like, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't always feel like I saw myself and my neighbors reflected in a lot of the news. And when I did, they always kind of came in two forms. One was mooching the system in some fashion or the victim of the system in some fashion. And so when I became a journalist, I really dedicated myself to elevating voices at all levels. And then when I left journalism, I joined Community Change, and we started this program of looking at how are we going to have people with lived experiences be reflected in the conversation and leading in the conversations. And not just as like poverty porn or like they're the anecdote that we're going to lead to get into the story. Then we'll have the actual experts talking about it and giving us the feedback on like what's really the policy. And then we'll close up with the lived experience person again, right? And I have been guilty of that. So I say that knowing full well, because sometimes when you're on deadline, you're on deadline. But part of the role that part of what I wanted to do is like shake that up and figure out like, how do we change that? Because there is such a deep need, as we are seeing now in the current environment that we are all in, to elevate all the experiences that we possibly can. And having them centered and having, I'll sorry to be using some nonprofit language, but really having them centered and having them be experts in the issues that affect and matter to them, including the policy stuff, including the feedback on academic reports, right? That they can be voices of lived experience at all levels, and not just when we need them transactionally as journalists to like, okay, we need like the voice and then we'll bring everybody else in. And that's what the kind of the crux of what we wanted to do with the Communications Fellows program was, how do we center these voices? And so we started this program with people who have lived in poverty, single moms who've relied on and needed government resources to be able to survive and to thrive for their families, undocumented residents, people who were formerly incarcerated, folks in the LGBTQ community, POCs. I mean, you name it, right? And then having them tell their stories of their communities and their neighbors through all the mediums that we use, all the media that we use as storytellers, and having them be multi-platform storytellers as well, right? So they're doing podcasts and they're doing photo stories and they're writing essays that get published in the New York Times and in Salon and Vox and all of the places. And, you know, our various blogs and tweets, and they're doing selfie videos and really kind of elevating their voices and diversifying their voices. And that's just been a powerful program. And it's given me the ability as a storyteller to be very practical in how we bring these voices in. I'll stop there as an opening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you, I think the Communications Fellows program is so innovative and so unique, and there probably are lots of different examples you could give, but could you maybe sort of highlight one particular instance or two where you really saw a big impact, and then maybe also talk a little bit about the challenges that arise?
Yeah, absolutely. So one really huge example is one of the original Communications Fellows. Her name is Stephanie Land. And she was actually the very first fellow that I brought on when I joined Community Change in 2015. And Stephanie has since gone on to write a memoir of her life as a single mom working as a domestic worker to make ends meet for her and her daughter. And that book has become a New York Times bestseller, and it is also being translated into a Netflix series called Made. The name of the book is Made, and so it's being translated into a Netflix series, and it really shows the power of having diverse voices from that place of someone with a lived experience. And we've had other examples of a fellow, I'm thinking of one fellow in particular who was an undocumented resident and was brought to this country when he was 10 years old. And so he currently is an organizer and works a lot on issues related to organizing in the state of Florida. And through the work that we've done together, the op-eds that we've trained him on writing and the coaching that we've given him, he's become a powerful voice on issues related to immigrants and undocumented youth and dreamers, specifically in the Florida area, and has become a really strong voice of that. And Kristen, thank you for the question on the challenges, because there are challenges, right? I mean, we live in a society that has a lot of systemic inequities and inequalities. And so a lot of times when I am talking to folks and bringing folks in from varying class structures, different school systems, they're not all coming in as college educated, journalism trained folks, right? And so we've created a somewhat of a mini journalism writing spokesperson school mentoring. I don't want to call it school, but it's more like coaching and mentoring, right? I mean, we're working on really training people on how to be the most effective and the strongest writers that they can be within who they are and their authentic voice, because I'm not trying to take that away from them and having them write journalistically, because that doesn't help us, right? I mean, that doesn't raise the diversity of voices if all I'm doing is putting brown faces there and they're just saying the same things that other folks are saying, right? They have, the folks that are our communications fellows have really strong experiences. And so the role that we take on is much more of a coaching, mentoring, and we have to do a lot of that, right? And these are, a lot of our folks are also people that are living in crises. And what does that mean to work with and create team with folks that are living in crises and are having to navigate a lot of the systemic challenges that exist. So there just kind of is a lot of rethinking coming from the journalism world that I've done over the last 5 years.
I think I'm going to bring Marissa into the conversation now, and then hopefully the three of us together can talk about some of these issues. Marissa, could you talk a little bit more about, from your perspective, how you've been able to put a face on an issue, and then again, how you balance this notion of highlighting both individual experiences on the one hand, but also pointing out the systemic issues that are behind a lot of the challenges that people are really facing.
Absolutely. When we're starting out from a journalistic perspective, a lot of times what we're looking at, we're looking at a set of data, or we're looking at a system and a systemic issue that we find that's broken. And it's really important that we show people the human impact of that situation, because, in my experience, people oftentimes don't care about policies that governments have, or they don't, in terms of readership, they don't care about, data points. What they care about is people. And so what we try and do is, when we understand how a system is broken, or we're understanding, something that the data is showing us, trying to find people to show them the human impact of this. And, a simple example of that is a situation that we were investigating where we found that parents were falsely claiming that they had neglected their children because their children had a developmental disability or had been diagnosed with a mental illness, but not able to get the level of services that they needed. Private insurance wouldn't cover it. There weren't other avenues that they could pursue. And so what they would end up doing is falsely claiming that they neglected their children in order to get access to those resources. And, it became really important for us to show the impact of that and how it hurt families that were struggling and in kind of pursuing those situations. And I really love what Marisol said about amplifying people's voices in their own words, because that's something that we do try to do, throughout our journalism, as well as, my job is to sort of get out of the way and let their voices and their experiences be heard the way that they want to convey it, not the way that I, as a journalist, might want to convey it.
Thank you. So then, I guess that leads to a question, and please, both of you, feel free to jump in on this. This is something I also think about a lot, is then how do we balance then our relationships as either the journalist or the messenger, the author, with the folks that we're working with, who we can see are maybe having a really difficult time. We can use their own words, but then, a lot of times we develop close relationships, and, we might have ways that we could help, but where do we sort of draw the line there, or don't we?
I'm sure Marisol and I, because we operate in different spheres now, maybe the way that we do that is a little bit different. I mean, journalistically, my ultimate obligation is to the truth and to the public. But I'm also a human being, and I care. And, from my perspective, what I try and do is just over communicate what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, how their story fits into what I'm doing, to prepare them and make sure that they understand and that that's what they want. Because what we don't want is to pressure somebody into sharing something, especially if it's incredibly personal, that they aren't ready for.
Yeah. And Marissa, thank you so much for making that distinction, because now I am approaching it from a slightly different place. For me, it's really about coaching and mentoring folks, so that when Marissa comes and says, hey, do you want to tell your story? They are feeling comfortable telling their story. Part of that also is helping them find the empowerment in their story and being the leader of telling their story. Like, they get to lead on being able to tell their story, that their story matters. Because for so long, many of our folks and the folks that I work with in the Communications Fellows program, for a long time, for so long growing up, they were made to feel like your story isn't as important as what the MOC is saying, what the member of Congress is saying about your story, or the legislator, or the politician, or the police chief, or the mayor, or the teacher is saying about your story. That those folks and what they're saying is more important than yours. We're kind of just using you for, like, the background part of it, right? And so a lot of what I'm doing as well is around helping people see how important and how much their experiences do matter, and then coaching them to be leaders in that.
In that vein, actually, we have a question from the audience. Marisol, for you, although I think probably Marissa, you could weigh in on this as well. And the question is, can you reflect on Community Change's fellowship program in the context of the tradition of journalists not paying for their sources for their stories, and even on the academic side, the ability to pay people for participating in studies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to be clear that I'm not a journalist right now, and that my program is not a journalism program, right? My goal is really around elevating the voices of and experiences of diverse people. So I will say that we actually pay. They're paid. So we pay them a monthly stipend. We don't pay them per piece, but we pay them a monthly stipend to create videos that they choose, right? Because right now, if you are, I'll give you an example. If you are a single mom who is a Black woman and living in a community that has been ripped apart by COVID, she's going to have an experience and she's going to want to talk about what that is, or even just being a mom in the time of COVID when your kids are also home. And what does that look like? So we're not paying per piece, but we do pay them a monthly stipend as they're creating content in the same way that you all get paid a salary, right? And that I get paid a salary when I'm writing something or when I'm creating something or when you all are writing and creating stories. And so we pay them to also as part of the fellowship, because we don't want to take advantage of like them creating stuff for free.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that in the academic context, even when we have the ability to pay people for participating in a study and telling their story, whatever it may be, I think too often the conversation becomes at what level is it coercive versus at what level is it, a fair value for the time and, as Marissa was saying earlier, a really personal story. Sometimes it's something that maybe they wouldn't want to share otherwise.
Yeah, I think I would just add one thing that I do think that's a really important point, because our fellows really are the owners of their own beats, right? Which is their lives. I mean, the whole point is for them to be the leaders of telling their stories in the way they want to tell it, what part of their stories they want to tell, what part of the stories they don't want to tell. And so part of that is, you own this. This is yours, and you get to decide how you want to tell this story.
So even with that, the earlier somebody sort of Marisol, you mentioned the ways that traditionally journalism has portrayed either the person trying to work the system or often in the work that I've done, stereotype rather collect welfare than get a good paying job. Really exists. In what ways do we still, even with the approaches you take, maybe find it challenging to combat stereotypes, and how do you think about the way work gets presented, knowing what some of the stereotypes are?
Marissa, do you want to kick us off, or do you want me to?
Go ahead and start. I think she was posing it to you. That'd be great.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. You were going a little bit out. No, I think this is a big challenge. I mean, this is why we started this program to begin with, right? Was really trying to figure out like how can we really dismantle, right, the stereotypes that exist. And we're seeing that currently in so much of the work that's being done. I mean, this is one of the first times in my life and career of being in communications where I am seeing a lot of the way people thought about stuff as being dismantled. For so long, people who were protesting were all kind of equated with rioters. And I covered Trayvon Martin and Ferguson and Freddie Gray most recently, right? Chris Brown in Ohio. And, this time around, there's such a distinction in folks really like looking at all of the layers equally. And I just simple example is Juneteenth, right? Now, I have never in my 20-something year career of being in journalism first and now communications saw mainstream stories about Juneteenth. Never happened. People were like, June who? Right? There was no stories. And this year, it was like the history of Juneteenth and local coverage of Juneteenth events. Was that because of the president and his decisions around rallying in Oklahoma? Was that because of the current moment? I don't know, but I'm hoping that it's when these kinds of things happen that folks on the journalism side are saying like, oh, there is another perspective. Because we also do know, frankly, that, there's not a lot of diversity in journalism and there needs to be more. And that is an uncomfortable conversation to have for sure. But, you could look around any newsroom and let's be honest, and you could count on one, maybe two hands, the number of POCs and certainly the number of POCs in leadership. And so I think that does make a difference then in helping to dismantle, Kristen, what you are talking about, which is the stereotypes that exist.
Marissa, how do you see that in your world in the newsroom?
I think still in the journalism world, we absolutely can and should be doing better. And I think that there are a lot more conversations happening, as Marisol was saying, right now around how do we make sure that our coverage is accurate and reflects what's going on and isn't perpetuating stereotypes? How do we make sure that our newsrooms reflect the communities that we serve? How do we make sure that we're amplifying people's voices? All of those conversations are happening, and I think they need to be happening right now. And there's a lot more we can do. And I'm hoping that this will continue to move us forward over time.
We have a question from the audience, and again, I'll just remind people to please feel free to send us your questions either in the comments in YouTube or over Twitter. And this question is from Angela. And for both of you, how have you gotten policymakers or foundations to take the stories into their own world and to do something concrete to address the issues? I don't know if Marissa, if you want to.
Sure. From my perspective, in trying to get policymakers to pay attention to what we're doing, with the example that I mentioned earlier about the families that were struggling to access appropriate mental health services for their children, by highlighting not only the fact that it was broken, why it was broken, and the ways that it could be fixed, ultimately, through that series of stories and pointing out the impact of the situation that they were in, it put pressure on officials to do something to fix it because it could be fixed. And ultimately, in that particular case, they ended up approving a $25 million fund in which they would help families access appropriate mental health services without court intervention. So without families having to say that their children were being neglected. And, another example of that situation as well is through coverage and through persistent coverage, not necessarily one article, but continuing to write articles exposing what's going on. We did the same thing with USA Gymnastics, where we showed what policy USA Gymnastics had, how that policy did not align not only with the law in many states, but also with just best practices in child welfare and the impact of that policy on the safety of children in the sport.
Yeah, I would say from the sort of the nonprofit world side, there has been and has been for a very, very long time a lot of conversation around race and gender and the race and gender lens with which we operate, view the world, right? This like strong value around that. And that is something that you will see in a lot of spaces. And where it is starting to show up, and Angela, thank you for the question, because where you are starting to show up, and of course, for foundations, we always want to see it more, but they're funding more work that looks at these areas. So I'll give you an example. Community Change just finished a project, or is in the process of disseminating actually a project that we did, and it was a research around housing, right? And very specifically around what are the stories that are being told around housing? Is housing an issue that people care about? And very specifically, how does it connect to race and class, right? And really looking at like, what are the ways that we are talking about this, and what are people not hearing? What is it that we need to talk more about for them to understand sort of the ways that housing connects with their lives and their work? And that was funded by FHO. And so a series of foundations that come together around housing. And so you are seeing efforts like that. We are seeing a lot more research around race class narrative, so that there are folks like Anat Shenker Osorio. If you all don't know who she is, you should, definitely take a look at her, because she's really leading the way on how we talk about and need to be thinking about issues of class and race, especially so that we all can start to think about it, because it is a very, very hard conversation, right? As we are seeing now. And so, so we're seeing much more work around, like, how do we engage all people around something that's sticky and hard for us to acknowledge and talk about?
Yeah, I think that's so important, particularly when we think about ourselves. Our positionalities are different than the folks often that we're working with, and the ways in which sometimes we can gloss that over, or try to get past it, when maybe thinking through it in systematic ways is really the way to go. But have another question from the audience that that relates to some of these issues around funding. And I think for Marissa, can you talk a little bit about how funding cuts to news organizations are affecting efforts to diversify those organizations? And maybe, for Marisol, how funding challenges affect the work that you're trying to do with community change?
So I think I'd start by saying, as a reporter, my role is not in hiring or those sorts of things. I mean, I would say that it's acknowledged, right, that particularly in newspapers, that there have been fewer resources and that there have been fewer jobs. There was a study that recently came out that showed how many fewer newspapers there were in local communities compared to 2004. And so while I do think that challenges our industry, I also don't think it's an excuse to talk about, the reason for not affecting efforts to diversify organizations. There are still job openings. There are still things that, advancement happening within newsrooms. So I don't want the financial dynamics of the organization to, for lack of better terminology, maybe give a pass to how important it is that news organizations diversify their newsrooms and promote people of color.
Yeah, Marissa, thank you for that. I actually do want to add one quick thing to that as well before I answer Kristen's question too, specifically as it relates to the nonprofit world. I was a journalist for almost 25 years. And this job that I have now is the first job I've had outside of journalism. So I view the world through the lens of a journalist, first and foremost. And one of the things I will say about the question, and I really thank you, Daniel, for asking it, is that the way diversity has often worked in newsrooms is having the faces in the room, right? And so that when you have to do that ASNE study at the end of the year that says, how many Black reporters do you have? How many Black women do you have? How many Black men do you have? How many Latinx people do you have? How many, right? All that study, you can look out in the room and then be able to say, like, this is what we have. The challenge, you can get people in the room. The challenge is really not about getting people in the room. The challenge is really about giving them room or letting them elbow their way to the table and then listening to them when they say something. When they say, you know what, that headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer about property matters too, probably not the way to go, right? And so we the issue, not me anymore, but the issue is really in part not just about getting people in the room, but then once you get them in the room, they shouldn't just be there so you have boxes checked off for your ASNE study at the end of the year, but really about like, how am I listening to this person, right? We know that at PG, the 2 Black reporters that they had on staff were not allowed to be covering the protest because they were going to be seen as biased, right? And so really it's about honoring the expertise that all of your staff brings to the newsroom, not just certain segments. I think that's a really, as a longtime member of NHJ and, and past member of NABJ, like these are really important issues that in order for us to dismantle anything that we're talking about, the media is so important here. And that's why it needs to be as inclusive as it can be. And right now it still has a way to go. And Kristen, can you ask me your other question, or we can just stop there and after I got off my little?
Really about like how are there funding challenges to the work that you're doing as well?
Yeah, I would love to create a I don't want to call it a newsroom, but I would love to create a storytelling space of as many people as I can. I have people who have don't know the first thing about journalism, don't know the first thing about writing a story, but they love to write. And they grew up being told that their writing was not any good, right? Or that their writing was not fit for a paper or anything like that. And so being able to create a space that allows people, as many people as possible, to come in and tell their stories, I think is important. And I want to just clarify that I used the word journalism there, but I, as I said earlier, I'm not a journalist, but I am using journalistic tools around truth and storytelling and all of it, right? All the things that we use as journalists, I'm using those tools for the area that I'm working in now. And so where I get hampered is, I don't have 100 people that I like. And that's where funding just at the end of the day really comes in.
So one question, I'll take my own prerogative as moderator to ask you both to comment on, I'm thinking about when I have to write proposals to funders to get my own work funded, well, yes, I think there's this growing emphasis and desire to have people's stories featured very prominently. We call it qualitative research in the academic space. On the other hand, I'm sometimes faced with like, well, where's the data? These are anecdotes. So as we move to including more people's stories in our work, how do you sort of balance out stories with also, the comments that like, well, that's one person's story, but what are the data and what do the statistics really tell us?
I mean, that's tough, right? Because, sometimes the data is not there, or the data is dirty, or it doesn't show the full picture of what's going on. And, I do think, generally for bigger projects, we're looking for systemic dynamics, and we're looking, whether we can build databases or examine databases to understand what's going on. But I do also think that there is, as Marisol's doing with the work that she's doing, power in importance of individual voices and individual people's stories, because it's still a reality that people are living, and whether it affects one person or 100 people, if it's wrong, it's still wrong. I don't know. What do you think, Marisol?
Yeah, I would add 2 things to that. Yes to everything, Marissa, that you just said. And the other 2 things that I would add is, one, as a storyteller, right, and as a former journalist, and as journalists, you think about the stories that resonate, or the issues and areas that resonate for us, that kind of stuck with us. They're always going to be stories. They're always going to be about, when I think about my time in South Africa, for example, that story had a lot of data about the inequality that exists in South Africa as a country. But the stories that stayed with me was in being in the neighborhoods and meeting the kids who couldn't go to school, right? And there's data points on that, but it was really the people that I met. And I think that's true for all of us, like a human nature. There's a humanness to stories that I think are really powerful. And then the second thing I would say about data is that data sometimes also is reflective of inequities and inequalities and is only as good as the people that are creating the data and asking the questions. And is only as equitable and it is only as equitable, excuse me, as the person that is, or the people that are creating the data, right? And so we think of polls for however long in time, right, don't always oversample for low-income people. They don't always oversample for Black communities and Latinx communities and Native American communities, right? And so then you end up undersampling these folks and you have these polls that say XYZ, and then they don't always come to pass because you haven't actually sampled everyone that you should have been sampling or asking the kinds of questions that would be reflective of a more inclusive community.
I completely agree. I just want to say, like, exactly what Marisol just said. When I look back at the articles that I've done in my career, what I remember are the stories of the people. I don't remember necessarily the data points, although even if I remember them, they're not the things that like keep me up at night or that I think about and wonder how people are doing, those sorts of things. It's really the stories of the people. And, one of the big frustrations can be with the data collection. There's a project that I'm working on right now, and the fact that we can't get access to certain things or understand certain components that are really important of what people are experiencing is frustrating. And it's just a reality that we have to deal with, Yeah,
no, great. I think great and important points. And I think too, sometimes about in my own work that even if the data were collected with equitable sampling frames and it was very inclusive, we also don't always know what the meanings that people are that behind the data, and different people attach different meanings to their experiences that may not get reflected in those data points.
I was just going to add one other thing just one other quick thing around data is that if 3, 4, 5 Black people are telling you this has been my experience, then but we don't have the specific data, I think that to me is a signal like we need to look at this because there's something here. Maybe the data hasn't caught up. Maybe we don't have data. But man, I've got 5 people telling me that there's a systemic problem here that we need to dig into, right? And so that should also, and as a reporter, those are, right, like good sources too, right? USA Today, 3 is a trend, right? So we really, and so that's a joke. But I'm just saying, like, that makes a difference too, that we should be listening to the experiences of people.
I mean, I completely agree with you. That is really how the Larry Nassar investigation happened. It started with 3 people. No, 3 is a trend thing, but
yeah.
It started with 3 people from different parts of the country, from different levels of gymnastics who didn't know one another, sharing with us similar stories. And we believed it was important enough. We didn't need the database to back it up. It was important to share that story. And now, as of today, there are more than 500 people who have come forward with allegations against him. So I completely agree.
No, thank you both for those really insightful comments. And just as a little sidebar, very nice comment from someone who's watching who says, from a friend who says she loves to write and is going to go into journalism as a second career, and for affirming choices.
Way to go, Fran.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So just as, at least sometimes this artificial divide between data and people's stories can be a barrier at some point. Heather is asking about politics, and we know that right now there's a lot of division in our nation when it comes to political ideology. So she asks, do you think the political aspects of poverty and how politicians frame poverty get in the way of personal narratives having a bigger impact on readers? And that's really for both of you.
I can jump into that one. Yes, is the short answer. Excuse me. So I think about Ronald Reagan and his welfare queen speech, and that speech for a generation, if not more, became embedded in terms of into the lexicon and the culture in terms of who were the welfare queens, and really split people around the issue of poverty, because that's where this idea of people struggling to get by became moochers suddenly of a system. They weren't really struggling. They could have just gone out to work. And so that all of the systemic issues that you face in order to find a job that will help you sustain and pay for your food and the clothes that you have and the housing where you live, like that one job wasn't going to be enough. You were going to have 2 jobs. I mean, we've seen the data that supports how most people are out there working, but there was this catchy frame that he used to divide people and get them kind of like became code, right? Coded language. And dog whistle, dog screaming, dog barking language that we see pretty relentlessly. And we have seen relentlessly to divide people. And it just becomes even that much more incumbent for journalists and storytellers to shatter that and dismantle that, because I know that when you are all out there reporting, you are meeting a lot of people that are working 2-3 jobs, that are making $7.25 an hour in each one of those jobs, just to be able to take care of their kids and make sure that they can put some kind of food on the table, make sure that they can pay for the apartment or the house that they're renting, that frankly has lead and falling paint and all sorts of challenges. And so the way that this gets framed for people makes it harder then for them to be able to actually see the reality that people are living in. And so that becomes so much more important, right? For journalists to be like, oh, wait, I have to tell the real, I have to share all the pieces and all of the sides here, because we do talk about, as journalists, journalists do talk about telling all sides, and that means you have to actually tell all sides from that perspective. The other part of it too is that it means that for folks on my side of the storytelling, it becomes that much more important for the people that are living those experiences, who came here when they were 10 years old and were undocumented and living in poverty, to tell the experience of what it means to live their lives, right? Because at the end of the day, we all want the same things for our families, for ourselves, right? To have somebody like Stephanie talk about what it's like to be a domestic worker as a single mom, who maybe also would have fallen into the welfare queen category, although I will say she's white. And part of the welfare queen coded language was that we were talking about POCs, right? And women of color, specifically Black women, was the code that the nod that Reagan was giving, right? And so it becomes that much more important for families and people that are having this experience to talk about what it's like to live that experience.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's, it becomes, again, some of the stories that sharing, as you were talking about, Marisol, the examples of the people who may be receiving, federal support, and they do have jobs, they are working, but then as they're working and, getting to a certain threshold, then those benefits fall away, and some of that safety net to get them where they need to be falls away, and some of those sorts of dynamics. I think the other thing that has been challenging, we saw a lot of this conversation recently relating to SNAP benefits. There have been a lot of conversations in different states about whether to implement a work requirement and the dynamics of who is receiving benefits and things like that. The other conversation that has been happening is around unemployment, and it's been really interesting to see a lot of the coverage around that and the experiences of people, especially during the pandemic, who may be applying for unemployment for the first time and starting to understand how complex that process can be and how difficult it can be to access that funds depending on what state you're in.
And actually, I want to lift up USA Today as also my alma mater, but journalism alma mater. But I do want to lift them up. Marissa was just talking about the unemployment stories, and USAT has done some really great work around unemployment specifically and raising a lot of diverse voices. The work that Deb Barry has been doing, Alan Gomez, like that really shows both that on the other side of that, this is how inclusion in journalism can look like. And it's not about like, we got to take a side for one group of people over the other. That's not the conversation we're having. It's more about like include equally with equity, all the voices, to value all the voices the same, not like this, but the same. And pointing to the unemployment work that you all did, I'm just thinking of a couple of stories very specifically with Alan and Deb Barry as the authors, really exemplified exactly what you're talking about, Marissa.
They've been doing great work. Yeah.
Thanks. Your comments in this exchange sort of reminded me of one issue that I think can be challenging in this kind of work, and I'm sort of curious to hear your thoughts about it. It's when we do lift up people's lived experience, or when they themselves talk about it, we can find out that people are working 2 or 3 different jobs. They're having difficulty applying for unemployment because, the process is so cumbersome, or if you live in the state of Michigan, you can't even get onto the computer system. And so hardship often is the fallout of that. What sorts of techniques or what sorts of ways do you think about balancing out, the true, real lived experience that people are experiencing, which might be really negative, with also not diminishing people's strengths and the real fortitude that they have?
I mean, from a journalistic perspective, it's when you're sharing people's stories, sharing the full aspect of their stories, and not just, maybe the one struggle that they're going through, but also all of the other things that they're doing and accomplishing, and the scope of the people that they are. And it's hard sometimes journalistically to do that, and to have the time and the space to do that, particularly in TV journalism as well. But as much as we can to try and be broad and just beyond, as Meryl Saul was saying in the beginning, right? They're not just the anecdotal lead, and that the person to come back to at the end of the story, that their experiences and the information that they're sharing is more than that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. And from my perspective, I mean, that's the root right there of the program that I run, because when you get to tell your own story, I'm also a Hamilton fan, right? And so it's all about story and who gets to tell your story and how your story gets interpreted and how your story gets told by the middle guy, right? Or the middle person. We're trying to take that away. We're trying to have people be the owners of their own story, that they get to tell this. And when you tell your own story, you're always the hero of your story, right? I mean, you're always going to talk about what is the conflict that you had to overcome, or in some cases you don't overcome. In some cases you're like living in that conflict right now, and you're sharing like all of yourselves around like how you're trying to sobrevivir, how you're trying to survive and overcome that challenge. And so I think that when you get to own that yourself, that's part of the key. And so that when you are a journalist and you are the middle person translating, interpreting that, like as much as you can take yourself away from the interpretation and the translation, that becomes important. As Marissa says, that you are really capturing what this person is about, and not just the experience that they have to highlight the policy thing, but that you are also asking them about the policy thing too, like letting them weigh in just as equally as the member of Congress who is for or against it, or the academic who is for or against it.
Absolutely. And I want to make a point about language too. I'm so glad you brought that up, Marisol, because, you know, one thing that does come up a lot in conversations that I'm having with sources is, you know, there'll be questions about how you phrase certain things. And I always err on the side of, in my conversations, how do you want, like this is your story, your words, how you frame it and like what you are comfortable with is what's important, you know, and making sure that the integrity of their voice comes through.
Yeah, and in the work I do, I've been trying to pivot some of my own work to be more participatory in nature. So, you know, yeah, letting people talk about like how is it that you see yourself, and how is it that you view the policy, rather than me trying to be so much of the middle person. But it can be tricky to do, and a hard balance. I just want to take a couple more questions from the audience, and I think one maybe that picks up on some of the themes we've been talking about thus far. How do we think about recreating stereotypes, though? Like even if we're letting people speak for themselves, even when we're trying to tell a full story. Daniel had asked, what role the media played in spreading the welfare queen story, and could it have been done differently? How do you think about in your own work, like not creating or reinforcing a stereotype that might already be out there?
Yeah, that's something that we think about a lot in the work that we do. And, I think we do the best we can with what we have. And I think it becomes really important to seek out, as Marisol was saying earlier, a variety of expert voices, including the people who have lived experience, because they are experts of their experience and of that system that they have been interacting with. But also they're exceptional people from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of geographic locations, who have experiences that they can share, and just trying to get as much of a scope as we can and to show the broadness of a situation. So not just making the easy phone call because you're on deadline, making sure that you're making that effort to take the next step. And it can be challenging sometimes, but it's really important.
Yeah, Marissa, that's so right. Because as you were talking, right when you said it, the first thing that I thought was, well, don't be a lazy reporter. And that was what I was thinking. Then you said it much more eloquently than I would have, than I was originally thinking it, but I just ended up saying it. But it's the truth, right? I mean, the way things get spread is because you hear a catchy phrase or a catchy frame. It sounds like a quote. It's a quote, man. That is a quotable thing. But guess what, right? Then it becomes repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. And then it becomes an enduring image. And when it does get challenged, which it does, because there are reporters that challenge that. There's no question reporters challenge the welfare queen idea. as folks have in all of the recent controversies that we've faced over the last several years. But the challenge is that, that catchy thing is the thing that people remember. The data, not so much, right? So we try to combat with facts and data. And the reality is that cognitively, people are not hearing things in that way. Cognitively, people are hearing stories. They're hearing conflict. They're hearing the tension. Those are the things that then people will grab onto, which is why from my end, it becomes so important for us to be able to make sure that all of the stories we're hearing are diverse and inclusive of everyone, to be able to challenge that welfare queen idea, for example, that Daniel just followed up with. I mean, if I had been running this program in the 80s, and it was a very different time, so I don't even know that I would have been able to run this program in the 80s. But if I had, you can rest assured that all 20 something of the fellows that I work with would have been writing stories about, like, wait a minute, I'm a mom and I struggle to get by. I'm not a welfare queen. Or, well, we wouldn't say I'm not a welfare queen, but I work and I do this and I do that, right? I wouldn't necessarily repeat the frame. But you can rest assured that we would have been doing a lot of stories that are the counter of that, from that personal experience.
Or, you can't be if you can't even get on welfare benefits in the first place.
Yeah, that's right.
So, as we know, this conference is one that is bringing together people from the journalism space, people from academia. I wanted to make sure, before our session ends, that we can talk a little bit about the roles that academia and journalism can play together. So David had asked, as more universities like U of M increasingly embrace a more prominent public engagement mission, what role can they play in helping to build community-based storytelling capacity? If either one of you want to comment on that, or even talk a little bit more broadly about what role you see universities and academia playing in the work that you do around storytelling.
I would say from my end, several things. One is academia also needs to be more diverse, like straight up. And again, same as with journalism, it's not about having a Latina woman as a professor or a Black man as a professor, and then having them in the room so that folks can say, hey, we have a very diverse teaching staff. It's about making sure that when they speak, we're hearing them, right? So one thing is around what true inclusion means at the academic sense. And then I think that once that you start to really think about what that is, it starts to show up in a lot of the work, the kinds of studies that folks will want to engage in, how they engage in those studies, the questions that they ask related to those studies, who they choose to tell those studies, right? Because you can't talk to every single person in all of it, but really looking at like how and who you tell the kinds of stories that will resonate with the research that you're doing.
Marissa, have you ever worked with academics at all in the work that you do?
Certainly, we've, through many investigations we've done over the years, we'll lean on people who are experts in, in sharing perspectives. I will say, to the question of, academic research and partnerships, that, I do think that one thing that we're careful of is, we appreciate when universities and professors reach out to us about research, but we're also really careful to read sort of the limitations of those studies to make sure that we understand exactly, the scope of what was involved and sort of the frame that it was when we're looking into those. But, certainly, especially throughout the pandemic, having people who are experts in infection control, experts who are, medical experts, has been helpful to educating the public about what's going on and what the response to it has been.
Can I add one? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please do.
No, I was just going to add one other thing to that as Marissa was saying that that resonated for me, because the other thing is that so many experts and policy folks are often, journalists will turn to universities and academics for a lot of information and sort of history setting and context setting. And one of the things that I just think is really important, and this is where universities can really play a role when I talk about bringing in diverse voices and inclusivity, is that often when people of color, for example, are included, it's around an issue that directly connects or affects people of color. But as Marissa was just mentioning, you want epidemiologists, then you should have a pretty inclusive and diverse group of epidemiologists or public health experts that can talk about the wide range of everything. And so I think that part of the dismantling is also not just putting people into the little corner that they can talk about, but that they can, all of us that are experts in our field can talk about the range of things related to our field, not just a little sliver that, in my case, for example, connects to Latina women communicators, right? I mean, we can talk about the full range of the power of communications and storytelling. And I think that on the academic also growing what that looks like is important.
Yeah, I agree. I think just as journalism rooms, newspaper rooms need to and are working toward diversifying their own staff, academia needs to be really concerned with the pipeline of who are we training and what are we training and folks to do, and not assuming that if we have a student of color that means they are going to study a particular type of issue, and really being inclusive in sort of pushing our expectations about what people want to talk about. So that epidemiologist, reflects the population as a whole. We have a very philosophical question that has come up, which I'll pose. So I think it's it underscores some of what we've been talking about, and that is, how do you think about the connection between stories and journalistic truth? Do you think that stories tell the truth, and are they essential to understanding the truth?
That is philosophical. Marissa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I mean, from my perspective, I think that journalists try very hard to share the truth. The vast majority of journalists are people who care very deeply about giving the public a fair and accurate picture of what's going on. I think when it comes to journalistic truth, just using, again, USA Gymnastics as an example, 3 survivors reached out to us and shared their stories about Larry Nassar, and it was the first time that we had heard allegations of child sexual abuse against him. But we still did all of the due diligence that we would do with any journalistic story. So, is there a way we could be wrong? We looked into things such as if a survivor said abuse happened at a particular event, was that individual at that event? Was the person they've accused at that event? In fact, checking as much information as we can so that we make sure that we're putting accurate information out to the public. And, even before the Nassar piece, when we did the broader investigation looking at USA Gymnastics, we were constantly asking ourselves, could I be wrong? Is there something I'm missing? Is there somebody else I should be talking to? Some other document that I need? Because we take that obligation very, very seriously. And so, do I think that every journalist gets it right all the time? No, but I think that the vast, vast majority of journalists are trying really hard to put truth out there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And I love this question because it feels like a very journalistic question, right? So I'm going to jump in because I have a lot to say on this, but I'll try to keep it brief. When you think about journalism and stories, like journalism is stories, right? I mean, the first version of history is journalism kind of thing, right? But they're all based on stories. And every single person you talk to is telling you their version of the story, their version of the truth. And part of why I love this question so much is because it highlights exactly why we have the challenges, frankly, that we have. Because for so long, and I'm going to use a lot of the challenges that we are facing currently around race, that are challenges that have been there forever and a day. We know since the beginning of our country's history, they've been there. But guess what? When the police would say to us as journalists, or say to a journalist, that person was running away from me, and that's why we shot them in the back. That person had something in their hand. I thought it was a gun. That person, we had to put our knees on their neck because they didn't listen to what we were doing. And then and those stories by the officialdom were the ones that were reported out. And then, of course, the community and the parents and the families were like, no, my kid doesn't do that. But guess what? That kid had a record. So yeah, he must have been a bad kid, right? In quotes, all of that is in quotes. But suddenly, thankfully, because of all of the technology that we have in the world, these incidents and these confrontations are getting filmed. And then people are like, whoa, that person wasn't actually doing that. And it starts to make us question the stories that we were telling before as journalistic and official because they were coming from official sources, right? And now we're starting to really reframe and rethink about them a little bit because what we're seeing on these videos is not quite what other folks have been telling us for a very long time. And so to the question, and thank you so much for asking it, because to me, I think it just really gets to the heart of like, whose stories do we value, right? Whose stories are we telling? And now what I'm seeing in a lot of the coverage is that we're starting to finally value all those stories, because the reality is every person you talk to is telling you a story. Every single person, all the officialdom, they're telling you their party side of the story. They're telling you their incident side because we're all seeing it from our own perspectives.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of your answers. And, just to piggyback on that for a moment, I mean, yeah, whose truth gets to matter, I think, is always, to me, the central question. I mean, in the work that I do, and other folks who do more qualitative research, there's been a move in some corners to hold us to journalistic standards and have us fact check what people tell us. And I think it speaks to some of what we've talked about throughout our discussion. That so many people's stories are devalued that when they tell it, the assumption is that we must need to fact check it because they must be telling us something wrong, instead of saying like, no, this is someone else's truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's
a question, a little less philosophical than that, but I
do appreciate the question, though. Thank you.
I think it was a terrific question, and I think one that is always good to ask ourselves periodically. We have a question from Jared Wadley, who's part of the University of Michigan's media. And he's asking, are there any success stories among people that you've interviewed either months or years later where things really turned around and things are better based on what they did or what they did in participating in some sort of initiative?
I can, sure. Yes, I mean, there's so many examples, and we know that initiatives that help people get out of poverty, that struggle out of poverty, whether it's helping them get jobs, access to education or college, we know a lot of those initiatives work, right? But what I would say to that is that those initiatives are funded for a certain number of people, right? Like you have an initiative that only will fund 50 people every year, or whatever that looks like. We're going to pay for 10 college scholarships for kids. And at the end of the day, those kids that were able to get into those programs, they succeeded and it works and they help. The challenge to me, is a little bit deeper in that, we need to figure out like not what is the initiative we need to create, but what are the systemic barriers that we face that then stop the other 85% of people that are struggling to get by to be able to achieve the same success for that others maybe had because they were able to get into that particular program that only allowed a certain number. So I can certainly point to so many examples and so many people, but the truth is that there are systemic challenges that have to be looked at so that we can then allow for the success to be the norm and not the I don't want to say the exception, because there are a lot of folks that can go through it, but that with an initiative can get through.
I love that. Yeah. Just very briefly, I mean, yes, to answer your question, anecdotally, are there successes? From a journalistic perspective, one of the wonderful things about social media is that, we stay connected to people and get to follow their experiences in a way that we didn't when I started my career. Social media was not a thing when I started my career, but I also think, to Marisol's point, making sure that, success for some people doesn't mean that a problem is necessarily solved. And so, keeping that in mind, certainly as a journalist, when we are looking into things too.
Also, success doesn't always mean that it's going to be long-lived either, right? Especially when we're talking about people who are living in kind of precarious situations, that success can often be turned around quickly.
Also, everyone's definition of success is different. So what success may be like for me may be very different from what Marisol considers success to what you consider success. I just making sure that we're not imposing our perception of what success should be on somebody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's such an important point, right? Because like we do see generationally, again, because of so much of the systemic challenges that folks face, that the marginal successes that some people would consider marginal successes, but are huge successes because you were able to like buy a house. Woof, that was like a huge success, right? And so that's a really good point, right? Because we think of like of stories and narratives like the American dream, which is frankly, right, a narrative. Talk about journalistic truth, and that, right? That is a narrative that has that we as a nation were created on. But somebody's American dream, my American dream, is not the same as somebody else's, right? Based on like where we come from or our experiences.
So we're headed toward the end of our session. So I do want to encourage anyone who's listening, if you have any last minute burning questions, to please post them. So I have a question, I think it's for Marisol, though again, I think Marissa can weigh in this. And this question is, becoming the face of an issue comes with public scrutiny. How do you prepare your sources or communications fellows for that experience and make sure they're comfortable with how they're portrayed?
Yeah, that's a great question. We, again, a lot of this is us mentoring and coaching them about telling their story and what they feel comfortable in telling. And I want to be clear that they can be sources for the media if they so choose, but that's not the role that they really have. They actually are the content creator. They are the story creator. So they're writing an op-ed that then they'll pitch and they'll say to me, Marisol, I really want to write this piece about what it's like to live in a community being ravaged right now by COVID. And I want to pitch it to my local newspaper, right? As an example, as an op-ed. And so I'm coaching them on how to tell that story. What is the part of the story that they want to tell? And then I'm like, okay, well, how do you want to open up? What do you think is the important way to open up? Where do you think what is your lead? What's your nut graph? Like, what are the points you want to use that you think make sense to support that nut graph? How do you want to end? How do we get back to the beginning? Like, all of that's how I'm jumping in, but they're leading the train on like, what is the story they want to tell and all of that. And then, I talked about Stephanie Lance, for example, who is someone who has been interviewed very much around her memoir and her book. And part of why she was interviewed, frankly, is because, she's telling this first person story of what it means to get by from the person living it and experiencing it, not through somebody who, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote this amazing story as a journalist living as a domestic worker in a hotel, and she did a few other hourly wage jobs. But she was jumping in for the period of time that she was writing a book, and then she was jumping out because she was a journalist, right? This part of why Stephanie's book really resonated was because this was Stephanie writing the book from Stephanie's perspective as the person living the thing, right? And so where we're not training specifically around like, are you comfortable with how you're being portrayed? I mean, we talk about that, but part of rooted in the conversations and training that we're doing is like, we need you to be comfortable in telling your story because you are the one who is portraying yourself. So I'm going to turn that question back around because it's more about like how we and I and they are portraying themselves.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a switch.
I completely agree with that. And from our perspective, right? So we are portraying someone else in the way that, we're interviewing people and sharing their stories. And, to answer the question from a journalistic perspective, where we are sharing someone else's story as opposed to our own, it's really about communicating and in some cases over communicating. So, as I was talking about earlier, that we're not just, tell me this stuff and, I'm going to write it. It's communicating about what we're working on, how their story fits into it, and also the potential aftermath of it. So to give you an example, and I can speak to this now because they have come forward publicly about their experiences, but Jamie Dansher, who is an Olympic medalist, a gymnast that we interviewed, who is a survivor of Larry Nassar, had been one of the first people who came forward about him. And she speaks about that publicly now. And at the time, though, she was not public. And so we had a lot of conversations about making sure that she was comfortable with the amount of detail that was out there in the public. And also the fact that even if we don't name her, that there is still the potential that someone else might out her and that we could not control that. And was she prepared for that? Was she comfortable with that possibility? And, was she still willing with understanding the full picture of not only what was happening, but what could happen? Did she still want to move forward? And, she has talked about, while being prepared for that, how difficult the experience was at first. Rachel Denhollander has talked about that as well, because when we first started that particular investigation, until he was charged with federal possession of child pornography, a lot of people told us that we were wrong and that Larry Nassar, was a good man and a good doctor, and that there was no way that he did the things that people said he did. And so the people who shared their stories and came forward really had to deal with that pushback, just as the journalists who covered it, my colleagues, Mark Alicia and Tim Evans and I, heard a lot of pushback on that. And so I realize that's a long answer to your question, but to say over communicating and make sure that people understand the different ways that it could go is so important to the process, to treat people with respect so that they aren't blindsided by something, because the last thing that we want to do as journalists is to make a bad situation worse.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this particular session, with a lot of different reoccurring themes. But in our last 5 minutes, I thought maybe the both of you could give some of your fellow journalists and others who are storytellers some advice. And so what would you say would be different ways you could identify sources that exemplify a certain issue, keeping in mind that you want to be very inclusive? Do you have any tips for folks who are trying to incorporate more storytelling into their work?
I actually have two that I use pretty frequently, or three maybe that I use pretty frequently, particularly when you work for a national paper. Being able to look at local papers for trends was always really important. But I'll take it one step further, which is not just look at the local papers, but also look at the Black media, look at Latinx media, look at the media. I speak Spanish, so I also was able to look at Spanish language newspapers. But if you speak another language, look at the newspapers of those languages as well. Like, not just confining yourself to mainstream media, right? And so really looking at all media. I mean, Spanish language radio was a place where I would always listen to it because I wanted to see what people were talking about. People were always having conversations about, you name the thing that could lead me to say, oh man, that's a really good story. I'm going to look into that. There might be something there. And so really diversifying where you look for sources. That's one. Two is, all journalists will go to organizations always. Again, when you're a national organization, you tend to look at national groups. When you are a local journalist or state journalist, you'll look for whatever that level is where you're at, either local or state. But really, there are more groups than I could ever really even estimate, right? But really get to know all the variety of grassroots groups that are out there, because they are going to be working on whatever your issue is, not just in your area, but everywhere, just to really get a handle on what's happening at that grassroots level. And grassroots folks are always going to have some connection. It is the organizing world, for example, grassroots organizers, it's a small world, community organizers. It's not a huge world, but those are the folks that are doing the work that you want to be looking at in terms of stories. And then the last thing is that, those folks that you're using for anecdotes, keep them really sharp in your Rolodex, and don't just think of them as the anecdote people, because you can call them back and be like, hey, do you know this person who does this, that, and the other thing? So those were the three things that I always did.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just very quickly add to that, as a journalist, what I make a point to do is build up, as Marisol was saying, my Rolodex of people, of experts, of diverse voices from all different perspectives of an issue in parts of the country, in situations before I need them. So, as a journalist, I have a personal goal that I connect with 2 new sources every week and try and just, not with a particular article in mind, I'm not trying to interview them for a particular thing that I'm working on, just to say, what matters to you? What do you care about right now? What do you wish that somebody like me would be writing about? What's on your mind? And just having an open conversation to really just hear from as many people as I can.
Thank you. Thank you both for the tips, and thank you both so much for spending time with us this afternoon. We've come to the end of this conversation, which has been terrific. And while this is the end and is the last session in our series. We really hope that the conversation just doesn't end with the series. One of our goals is really to build a network of academics, researchers, practitioners, and journalists. So I invite everybody to check out our resources, to tune into additional events that Poverty Solutions will be holding, and find other ways to connect with us and other researchers and journalists on our website, poverty.umich.edu. So I really hope you'll stay in touch, and thanks to everybody for participating.
Thank you both. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Do we leave the studio?